Hey there. Welcome back for another ASMR video. Today we're talking about this map of the Persian Empire under Darius and Xerxes. We're gonna talk about all of these cities and the rulers who made up this great empire. The Persian Empire is the name given to a series of dynasties centered in modern-day Iran. From the 6th century till even into the 20th century. The first Persian Empire was founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BC. And it became one of the largest empires in history. At its height, it encompassed the Balkans all the way to the Indus Valley. And it encompassed modern-day Iran, Egypt, Turkey, and parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Iran is home to one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, dating back 7,000 years, which we can find evidence for this in the city of Susa. The southwestern and western parts of the Iranian plateau host many early civilizations. Elam in the early Bronze Age and later the Kassites. And it was not until the Medes unified Iran to one nation and empire in 625 BC. It's really when it began its journey to becoming a superpower during this period. In fact, the Achaemenid Empire, as it's known, encompassed 40% of the global population, which was about 49.4 million people of the world's 112.4 million at roughly 480 BC. The earliest artifacts date even back to 10,000 years ago, as they have discovered Neanderthal artifacts, early agricultural communities during the period of 10,000 through 8,000 BC began to flourish in and around the Zagros Mountains region in western Iran. At that same time, they found the earliest evidence of clay vessels models, modified to look like animals and human figurines. In the southwestern part of Iran, this was known as the Fertile Crescent, which is where most of humanity's first major crops were grown. Early communities flourished around 10,000 to 8,000 BC in and around the Zagros Mountains in western Iran. They have found artifacts of human and animal figurines in this region. In the southwestern part of Iran is the Fertile Crescent, where most of humanity's major crops were grown in villages such as Susa, as I mentioned before, where a settlement was founded early as 4395 BC. There's many 7,000-year-old jars of wine excavated in the Zagros, as well as many settlements. In the Bronze Age, Susa really became a powerful city. It's one of the oldest known settlements of Iran and the world. As I said, in 4395 BC, they really exploded around the same time as Uruk, which was the ancient Sumerian city. They said that Susa was an extension of the Sumerian city of Uruk, hence incorporating many aspects of Mesopotamian culture. In its later history, Susa became the capital of Elam, which emerged as a state in 4000 BC. There are many prehistoric sites along the plateau, pointing to the existence of many ancient cultures and ancient urban settlements in the 4th millennium BC. In 646, Assyrian king Ashurbanipal sacked Susa, which ended the Elamite supremacy in the region. For over 150 years, Assyrian kings in the nearby northern Mesopotamia had been wanting to conquer the Median tribes of western Iran. And under the pressure from Assyria, these small kingdoms coalesced into increasingly larger and more complex states. The Medes gained their independence and were united. In 612 BC, Nineveh was destroyed, and that was the ancient capital of Assyria, and that sacking led to collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Medes are credited with essentially then founding Iran as a nation and an empire. And that was really the largest of its day until Cyrus the Great. He established the unified empire of Medes and Persians, which led to the Achaemenid Empire between 550 and 330 BC. So, as I said, the Persian Empire started as a collection of semi-nomadic tribes who raised sheep, goats, and cattle on the Iranian plateau. Cyrus the Great, as I said, was the leader of one of these tribes. In 539 BCE, King Cyrus decided to expand the boundaries of Persia. He began by conquering Babylon. Unlike the Assyrian king, Cyrus was known for his mercy rather than his cruelty. For example, he allowed the Hebrews who had been captives in Babylon to return to the holy city of Jerusalem. He and his successors employed a policy of adaptation and reconciliation toward all of their subjects. Obviously, this is viewed from the perspective of their peers, of course, but they cooperated essentially with local rulers and really didn't deal with matters not directly related to their rule. So they did respect local traditions and even adopted some of the religious practices for themselves. Cyrus and his successors employed a policy of reconciliation and adaptation. Obviously, this is viewed from their peers at the time, but comparably, they cooperated with local rulers and interfered as little as possible with matters that didn't affect their role. They respected local traditions and even adopted some of their subjects' religious practices for themselves. The Persian Empire started as a collection of semi-nomadic tribes who raised sheep, goats, and cattle on the Iranian plateau. Cyrus the Great was the leader of one such tribe. In 539 BCE, King Cyrus decided to expand the boundaries of Persia. He began by conquering Babylon. Unlike Assyrian kings, Cyrus was known for his mercy rather than his cruelty. Of course, this is important to keep it in a historical context because by today's standards, we'd probably view it differently, but back then, he was viewed as a just ruler. For example, he allowed the Hebrews who had been captives in Babylon for 30 or 50 years to return to the holy city of Jerusalem, instead of turning them into slaves. He returned sacred items that were stolen from them and allowed the rebuilding of the capital and the temple. Cyrus also allowed the Hebrew people to continue living and worshiping as they chose. He and his successors employed a policy of adaptation and reconciliation toward all of their new subjects. They cooperated with local rulers and interfered as little as possible in matters that did not directly relate to their rule. Essentially, they respected the loyal traditions as long as they got their tribute. Cyrus initially revolted against the Median Empire in 553 BC, and by 550 BC succeeded in defeating them, and he took over the Median capital of Ecbatana. Once in control of Ecbatana, Cyrus styled himself as the successor and assumed control of the empire. By inheriting this empire, he also inherited the territorial conflicts the Medes had with Lydia, which was another power in the region, and the Neo-Babylonian empires. Rather than destroy local economies for selfish gain, the Persians worked to increase trade throughout their kingdom. They standardized weight systems, developed official coinage, and implemented universal laws. The Persian leaders required cooperation and imposed a 20% tax on all agriculture and manufacturing. They also taxed religious institutions, which, despite their wealth, had previously not been taxed. The Persians themselves, of course, paid no taxes. The Persian kings, especially Cyrus and later Darius, developed a model for the administration of a large empire which was copied by many, many others in the future. The laws were carried out relatively fairly and evenly among the various subject people. Of course, at the end of the day, they were still subjects. So, take that as you will. The Persians divided their empire into 20 provinces that were managed by governors. addition, they provided land to feudal lords in exchange for loyalty and guarantees of soldiers for the Persian army. Most of the people in the empire, including average Persians, were just struggling farmers and artisans or craftspeople. Cyrus and ultimately the Persian Empire built a communication network, which was the equivalent of a mail system. This was a long road, which we'll talk about, but it is the Royal Road here, which had way stations and could be used for fresh horses and supplies to get quick messages back and forth. Essentially, Cyrus, or in Farsi is known as Kurosh, and he was the founder of a multi-state empire, essentially, which is founded here in the capital region of Persepolis and Pasargadae, which does have some different spellings and pronunciations in Farsi as well, but the Achaemenids allowed a certain amount of regional autonomy in the form of a satrapy system. A satrapy was an administrative unit, usually organized on a geographical basis. A satrap, you may have seen this word, it's another word for a governor. A governor, essentially, who administered the region. A general supervised military recruitment and ensured order, and a state secretary kept records. And these two would report directly to the satrap, as well as the central government. It's very similar to a cabinet in today's politics. At different times, there was about 20 to 30 satrapies. You can see many of them here on this map. And we will discuss some of the different ones located throughout the Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great created an organized army, including the Immortals unit, which consisted of 10,000 highly trained soldiers under the Achaemenids. As I said before, trade was extensive and there was an efficient infrastructure. Like I said, there was tariffs on trade and, of course, tribute and agriculture were the major source of revenue for the empire. The satrapies were linked by a 2,500-kilometer highway, which I mentioned. The most impressive stretch being the Royal Road from Susa to Sardis, but it went to the far reaches of the empire as well and other routes. And this was built by Darius I and had, as I said, stations and caravansaries at specific intervals. And there was a relays of mounted couriers which could reach the remotest of areas in 15 days. One of the other highways of commerce was the Great Khorasan Road, which was an informal mercantile route that originated in the fertile lowlands of Mesopotamia. and snaked through the Zagros Highlands, through the Iranian Plateau and Afghanistan, and into the Central Asian regions of Samarkand, just over in this region here. This allowed for the construction of frontier cities like Syropolis. Following Alexander's conquest, this highway allowed for the fusion of many religions and cultures, and many empires to profit from trade between East and West. And it was formally rehabilitated and formalized during the Abbasid Caliphate much later on, which again formed a major component of the Silk Road. Depictions of Persian women at this time show them with a long dress and veils, which did not cover their faces nor their hair, only flowing down over their neck at the back of the head as an ornament. Royal and aristocratic Achaemenid women were given education in subjects that did not appear compatible with seclusion, such as horsemanship and archery. Royal and aristocratic women held and managed vast estates and workshops, and employed large numbers of servants and professional laborers. The royal aristocratic women essentially seemed to be big parts of public life and participated in hunting and feasts. So it's a bit different perhaps than in some ways today in certain Middle Eastern countries. So no woman ever ruled the Achaemenid Empire as a monarch or as a regent, but many queen consorts are known to have influence over the affairs of the state. Also, there's no evidence of women being employed officially in any administration or religious service. However, there are many women employed as laborers in Persepolis, where they worked alongside the men. They could be employed as leaders of the workshops that they worked at. And of course, they were given less than men, but they did receive pay. The Persian art included large carved rock reliefs cut into the rocks, many of them depicting equestrian scenes or battle victories. Ancient Persians were also known for their metal work. Many of the artifacts were smuggled out, unfortunately, especially gold and silver, in the late 1800s by pilfers, essentially. Or they would go to ruins, and it's still a problem today. In the ruins near the Oxus River in present-day Tajikistan, that was something that they took a lot of these artifacts and put them in museums. The history of carpet weaving goes back to nomadic tribes. Even the Greeks prized the artistry of these hand-woven rugs, which were famous for their elaborate design and bright colors, which were made from wool, silk, and cotton. The Persians also developed a religion based on monotheism, which was founded by the prophet Zoroaster, which was called Zarathustra in Old Iranian. Many of his ideas were collected in a series of poems, which became part of the religion's most sacred book called the Avesta. Zoroaster believed that people were training for a future life. He taught that the earthly world was a constant struggle between good and evil, and humans would have to choose between the two in preparation for a final judgment when the good would triumph over evil. The Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda embodied goodness and wisdom. Many religious scholars believe that Zoroaster's ideas influenced the development of Jewish and Christian traditions. Despite the leadership that I mentioned before, the empire did not last. There's a lot of reasons for this, but essentially they attempted to expand the empire into the Greece and overspent. And then, when they were weak, Alexander the Great rose to power and destroyed the Persian dreams of expanding their empire, which was in 331 BCE. He was only in his early 20s, but this video won't really be about Alexander. Surprisingly, Alexander the Great was an ardent admirer of Cyrus the Great, and upon Alexander's death, most of that territory then fell into the rule of the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid Empire. It wasn't until the 2nd century under the Parthian Empire, which you can see over here is Parthia, that the Iranian elites took back control of their land, quote-unquote, their land. Cyrus, of course, I didn't really finish his story, but it's not quite known exactly. There are conflicting stories, but in 530 BC, Cyrus presumably died while on a military expedition in Central Asia, and he was then succeeded by his eldest son, Cambyses II, and his younger son, Bardiya. This is kind of an interesting story, and I just want to quickly tell it to you before we launch into the meat of this video here, the map itself. But by 525, Cambyses, son of Cyrus, had successfully subjugated the Phoenicians, and Cyprus was making preparations to invade Egypt, the newly created Persian navy. So as you can see on here, Cyprus, that was conquered as well. Historically, Herodotus, this famous historian, depicts Cambyses as openly antagonistic to the Egyptian people and their gods, cults, temples, and priests. And essentially, these actions led to a madness that led to him to kill his brother and his own sister wife. Essentially, Herodotus says that Cambyses loses his mind, and that sort of leads to the honestly a succession of murdering between the families of the Achaemenid Empire. However, the story is pretty crazy because the events surrounding Cambyses' death and Bardiya's succession are debated heavily. They say that Bardiya and the other brother was assassinated in secret. So the majority of Persians believed him to be alive. So when Cambyses died, it was of course Bardiya's turn, and Bardiya was dead, but the people didn't know. So this allowed two of the Magi to rise up against Cambyses, and they were able to impersonate Bardiya because of their remarkable physical resemblance and shared name. A magus named Calmata impersonated Bardiya and incited a revolution in Persia. Cambyses heard the news and he began his trip back from Egypt. But he was wounded in Syria because he was going this way here, and he died of gangrene from his wounds. And so Bardiya's impersonator became the king. So here's where the twist of a twist happens. Darius, who was a member of the cabinet, essentially is the person that we heard this story from. He actually may have created this entire story as a way to justify taking the throne, because, of course, after all of this madness clears, he becomes the favorite and takes control. And what many hypothesize is that Bardiya was actually not killed by his brother Cambyses, but when his brother apparently died, it really was the real Bardiya who was claiming the throne as the rightful male descendant of the family. But Darius lied and said he was a fake. So the real one was accused of being a fake. So it was like a double switch. And so unfortunately for Bardiya and for Cambyses, Darius takes control, but thankfully for the Iranian Empire, he was a relatively successful leader. Now, part of the cause of the empire's decline has been placed on the tax burden, which really led to economic decline. An estimate of the tribute imposed on the subject nations was about $180 million per year. And that does not include the material goods and supplies that were sent and supplied as taxes. After the high overhead of the government costs, the military, the bureaucracy, the satraps, however much they could safely dip into the coffers for themselves, the rest was put into the royal treasury. At Persepolis, according to Diodorus, another historian at that time, Alexander III found some 180,000 Attic talents of silver, besides the additional treasure the Macedonians were carrying that they had already seized in Damascus. And this amount was about $2.7 billion dollars in today's money. And of course, Darius III, the failing king, had taken 8,000 talents with him when he escaped to the north. Alexander took this hoard of money and put it back in the economy. And upon his death, about 130,000 talents had been spent on building of cities, dockyards, temples, and the payment of troops, besides even the ordinary government expenditures. Additionally, one of the satraps, it was a Greek satrap, he'd made off with 6,000 talents, which Athens used to rebuild the economy after seizing it during the struggles with the Corinthian League. And one other concept, or one other theory that led to the decline, was the period following Xerxes, which was a failure to mold many subject nations into a whole. So there was not really a national identity that was never attempted, and this lack of cohesion led to the lack of efficiency in the military and collapse. So that all said, now let's talk about the Achaemenid rulers that are listed here, and then we can talk about some of these cities. So here we have our list of Achaemenid rulers. And of course, the first on the list, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's Cyrus the Great, known as Korosh. And he is the first leader of Achaemenid Persia. He was known by the Greeks as Cyrus the Elder. So, under his rule, the empire embraced many of the previous civilized states of the Near East, and they expanded into Central Asia, spanning from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. The empire was at its greatest, and it was really the greatest it had ever been seen by the standards of that time. And essentially, again, the maximum extent was between the Balkans and all the way to Thrace, Macedonia, all the way to the Indus Valley. Cyrus's rule lasted for about 30 years, and the root of the conquest was really the fall of the Median Empire, followed by the Lydian, and eventually the Neo-Babylonian Empire here. And as I said previously, he's known for his humanitarian policies, politics, and military strategy, and of course his influence on Eastern and Western civilizations. And even this influence extended to Athens, where the upper-class Athenians adopted aspects of culture of the ruling elite in Achaemenid Persia as their own. Having originated from Persis, roughly corresponding to the modern-day Fars province of Iran, Cyrus played a crucial role in defining the national identity of Iran. So the second ruler on this list is Cambyses, who we mentioned before. And the title of the rulers of the Achaemenid Empire were known as the King of Kings. And he was the son of Cyrus. And as I said, he had an entire controversy where he had essentially an inner conflict with his brother, and he really had a short rule before being overthrown by Darius. And of course, Bardiya, his brother, who may or may not have been a fake, took control of him as well, as he got injured in the thigh. In 3 weeks after an injury, he got gangrene in an area called Akbatana, and which is the modern city of Hama. So he died childless, and that's how the false Bardiya got control, and essentially how Darius the Great took it from there. So again, Bardiya is the third leader here, 522. You see about three different rulers here at 522. And Bardiya, as I said, was the younger brother of Cambyses and son of Cyrus the Great. So either he ruled the Achaemenid Empire for a few months in 122 or in 522 BC, or he was impersonated by a magus called Galmata. Really, I think this incident probably deserves its own video itself. But according to Darius the Great, Cambyses II, after becoming king of Persia and setting out for Egypt, Darius says he killed Bardiya and kept it a secret. However, as we said, according to Herodotus, gives 2 detailed stories. Bardiya went to Egypt with Cambyses and was there for some time, but later Cambyses sent him back to Susa out of envy. And because Bardiya alone could draw the bow brought from the Ethiopian king. And that is when Cambyses had a dream in which he saw his brother sitting on the royal throne, and because of this dream, Cambyses sent his trusted counselor to kill Bardiya. And so again, people did not know of his death, so the usurper, pretending to be him, proclaimed himself king on a mountain near the Persian town of Paishiavada. Darius claimed that the real name of the usurper was Galmata, a Magian priest from Media. But again, it could have been the real Bardiya. Cambyses died, but before his death, he confessed to the murder of his brother and publicly explained the whole fraud. But this is not generally believed to have taken place. Essentially, the new king, Galmata, transferred the seat of government to Media again, and essentially, because of this rumor, some Persian nobles again accused him of being an imposter, and 7 nobles formed a plot to kill Galmata, or the false Bardiya. They surprised him at a castle in Nisa, home of the Nicean horses, and killed him in September of 522 BC. And one of those 7 was Darius the Great, who I told you, the one who we are being told the story. And he proclaimed himself ruler shortly after. Next we have Darius I, who again took control through all this false Bardiya madness. He was leader from 522 to 486. Darius, also known as Dariush in Farsi, is also known as Darius the Great, and he was a Persian ruler who was the 3rd or 4th king of kings. He ruled the empire at its territorial peak, when it included much of Western Asia and the Balkans. Caucasus and most of the Black Sea's coastal regions, the Indus Valley and North Africa, and northeast, and Libya and Sudan, coastal Sudan. And again, Darius ascended the throne by overthrowing the legitimate Achaemenid monarch, Bardiya, who he later fabricated, as we said, to be the impostor named Galmata. The new king, Darius, was met with rebellions throughout his kingdom. The new king was met with rebellions throughout the kingdom and quelled them each time. A major event in Darius's life was his expedition to subjugate Greece and punish Athens and Eretria for their participation in the Ionian revolt. Although his campaign ultimately resulted in failure at the Battle of Marathon, a famous battle, he succeeded in the subjugation or resubjugation of Thrace and expanded the Achaemenid Empire through his conquests of Macedon and the island of Naxos, as well as the sacked city of Eretria. So I believe this map is from the time of Darius and the following leader, which is Xerxes. But essentially, Darius organized the empire into the administrative provinces known as satraps, which I mentioned before. He used a new monetary system and made Aramaic a co-official language, alongside Persian. He also built roads and introduced a standard measuring and weighing system. And that's essentially what helped centralize the Achaemenid Empire and unified it. He also worked on many other construction projects, including at Susa, Pasargadae, Persepolis, Babylon, and Egypt. He had the cliff face of Behistun inscription, so it's known as. It's a record of his conquests, which would later become an important testimony of the Old Persian language. Because again, the old one is not the same as the one they speak currently today. And Darius is also mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as well. So now we have Xerxes, who ruled from 518 to 465 BC. Xerxes is also known as Xerxes the Great and is the fourth king of kings. He was the son and successor of Darius the Great. And actually his mother was a daughter of Cyrus the Great as well. And he was the founder, as you know, of the Achaemenid Empire, so he had a lot of legitimacy. So he ruled his empire at its territorial apex, as you see on this map. He was actually assassinated in 465 BC at the hands of Artaxerxes, who was the commander of the royal bodyguard. Xerxes I is notable in Western history for his invasion of Greece in 480 BC. His forces temporarily overran mainland Greece north of the Isthmus of Corinth until the losses were too great, and they ended the second invasion decisively. However, Xerxes crushed revolts in Egypt and Babylon. He also oversaw the completion of many construction projects from Susa and Persepolis.
Much of Xerxes' bad reputation is due to propaganda by the Macedonian king Alexander the Great, who I mentioned. Alexander vilified Xerxes for various reasons, but that's essentially why we view him in such a negative way. I don't know if anyone's seen the movie 300, but that's the perfect example. Next we have Artaxerxes I, who ruled from 465 to 424 BC. He was the third son of Xerxes, and he may have been the Artaxerxes mentioned by Herodotus as being a satrap of the royal satrapy of Bactria, which is over here. In Greek sources, he is also surnamed the Long-Handed because his right hand was larger than his left. Artaxerxes was probably born in the reign of his grandfather, Darius I, to the emperor's son and heir Xerxes I. When Xerxes was murdered in 465 by Artaxerxes, the commander of the royal bodyguard and the most powerful official in the Persian court, with the help of a eunuch. In one of the Greek accounts, the aforementioned Artaxerxes then accused Crown Prince Darius, Xerxes' eldest son, of the murder, and persuaded Artaxerxes to avenge the patricide by killing Darius. But Aristotle gives another account in which Artaxerxes kills Darius first, and then killed Xerxes. After Artaxerxes discovered the murder, he killed Artaxerxes and his sons. And so now we're going to show Xerxes II in 424. One more. 3, 2, 1. So we have Xerxes II in 424, Sogdianus in 424, and then Darius II in 424, all the way to 404. So that was also Artaxerxes. So then we've got Xerxes II in 424, Sogdianus 424, and Darius II 424 to 404. So Artaxerxes, who died in 424 BC, was followed by his son Xerxes II, who we spoke about. After a month and a half, Xerxes II was murdered by his brother Sogdianus. His illegitimate brother August, who was also a satrap of Hyrcania, rebelled against Sogdianus, and after a short fight killed him and suppressed by treachery the attempt of his own brother to imitate his example, because again, he kills his brother, and the brother wants to kill him, and August then took the name of Darius. So that actually is known in Greek. They called him Darius Nothos, which means bastard. But in the records of the numerous Babylonian tablets that have been found, Xerxes II or Sogdianus occur in the dates as listed to be rulers. So essentially the reign of Darius II begins right after that of Artaxerxes I. That's why they're all listed there. Historians know very little about Darius II's reign. However, a rebellion by the Medes in 409 BC is mentioned by Xenophon. It does seem that Darius II was quite dependent on his wife, Parasatis. And there are some harem intrigues that were recorded as well, in which he played a disreputable part. Many papyri mention him as a contemporary of the high priest Johanan of Ezra as well, who's mentioned in the Bible. Next, that leads us to Artaxerxes II, who ruled from 404 to 358, also known as Arsis. Artaxerxes, as the son and successor of Darius II, faced opposition very quickly after he ascended to the throne from none other than his younger brother, Cyrus the Younger, who assembled an army composed of troops from his satrapy, as well as Greek mercenaries in a bid for the throne. They clashed in 401 BC, which resulted in the defeat and death of Cyrus. And so, following this, Artaxerxes II contended with several revolts by the Phoenicians and by Cyprus, and most importantly in the western satraps, known as the Great Satraps, ruled in the 360s and 350s BC. And of course, Artaxerxes II is considered to be the beginning of the lineage of the Parthian Empire, who later became the holders of the Persian culture and arch rivals to Rome. And now we move on to Artaxerxes III, who reigned from 358 to 338. Artaxerxes III is known as August, and he was the son and successor of Artaxerxes II. Before he ascended the throne, Artaxerxes was a satrap and commander of his father's army. As is common with the Persian lineage, he came to power after one of his brothers was executed and another committed suicide, and of course the last was murdered. And his father, Artaxerxes II, died, and so soon after becoming king, Artaxerxes murdered all of the royal family to secure his place as king. He then started two major campaigns against Egypt. The first campaign failed, and unfortunately that led to rebellions throughout the western part of his empire. He defeated the uprisings in Egypt and also stopped a revolt in Phoenicia. Again, you can see there's a common theme here that those regions tend to revolt over and over again. In his later years, he had a lot of pressure from Greece because of Philip II of Macedon, who tried to convince the Greeks to revolt against the Achaemenid Empire. There is also evidence of renewed building efforts at Persepolis, where he erected a new palace and built his own tomb, as well as the unfinished gate. Now we have Artaxerxes IV from 338 to 336 BC. He was also known as Artaxerxes, and he ascended to the throne after his father Artaxerxes III was assassinated or poisoned by the eunuch Bagoas. Bagoas actually put Artaxerxes on the throne with the expectation of being able to control him. But he instead attempted to free himself from Bagoas' influence. But Artaxerxes IV, ironically, tried to have that eunuch Bagoas poisoned, but did not succeed, and instead succumbed to poison himself at the order of Bagoas. And after that, Bagoas put Darius III on the throne. Next we have Darius III, who ruled from 336 to 330 BC. He was actually a distant relative of the Achaemenid dynasty, but was relatively obscure at this time. He was a bit of a war hero and was awarded the satrapy of Armenia. He also was placed in charge of the postal service, which was a high-ranking position. After Artaxerxes III was murdered, poisoned by Bagoas, he only reigned for a few years until Bagoas had him poisoned as well. Darius was then installed on the throne, and actually, ironically, forced Bagoas then to drink poison as well. It was then in 334 that Alexander the Great began his invasion of the Persian Empire, and he actually defeated the Persians with several battles and looting and destroying their capital, Persepolis. And it was by fire in 330 BC. Alexander pursued Darius, who fled, but Darius was killed by one of his relatives, whose name is Bessus. Bessus was the satrap of Bactria, as we see here. And Bessus is also known as our last ruler here of the Achaemenid dynasty, Artaxerxes V. And he, again, was the satrap of Bactria, but after he killed Darius, he proclaimed himself king and successor. So now that we've talked about all the rulers, let's go through this map and talk about all the cities so we can learn about what the world was like at this time. Alright, let's go. Alright, so we're going to start with the Great Sea, or the Romans called it our sea. It's also known as the Western Sea as well. I don't think this needs too much introduction, but that was what they called it at that time. So, first up we have Thrace, which was an ancient Greek Eritrean colony in Macedonia
which was located at the mouth of the Strymon River, which flows into the Aegean from the interior. And these are some of the cities here that we're going to talk about. But I believe Spartacus was Thracian, but it was really part of that Greco world, of great strategic importance to the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War. So the first city we have here is Eion, which was the subject of an attempted capture in 497 BC during the Ionian revolt by the Athenians. Unfortunately, the revolt failed and the Persians established permanent presence here. It was with the location where Persian King Xerxes I stored his war garrison. And one of the senior commanders was ethnically Persian here. So, that said, Xerxes had recalled most of the troops in the winter of 480 BC, but it was then captured by the Delian League in 475 BC by the Athenians, and from that point it fell under Greek control. Next, we have Doriskos, which is a settlement in Thrace here on the northern shores of the Aegean Sea. It was in Persian hands for many years after the second Persian invasion of Greece, and it was the last Persian stronghold in Europe. Doriskos was founded by Darius the Great in 512 BC. He built a royal fortress and stationed a large number of Persian troops there at the time of his Scythian campaign. It was the first place Xerxes the Great stopped to review his troops in 480 during the second Persian invasion of Greece. And it's notable because it was one of the few Persian towns in the Balkans that remained under the Persian sway, as I said, and it was never taken from the Persians. Doriskos exists at the modern village of Doriskos, which exists today. Now we have Ionia. Ionia was a region which is really the western coast of Turkey. It consisted of the northernmost territories of the Ionian League of Greek settlements. This whole area was never really a unified state, but it was named after the Ionian tribe, who existed during the Archaic period of 600 to 480 BC, who settled the shores and islands of the Aegean Sea. And essentially, this existed up towards Lydia, and it really was a region with a lot of strife between the Persians and the Greeks. The geography of Ionia placed it in a strategic position that was both advantageous and disadvantageous. It was a maritime power, and its coast is rocky and arable land. The people who lived there, for the most part, kept their fields further inland and used the rift valleys for wooded pasture. The coastal cities were placed in defensible positions on islands or headlands, so they controlled the inland
this many had come from a lot of these different Mediterranean cities. Essentially, these became subject to Persian rule under Cyrus the Great. In this position, they enjoyed a good amount of autonomy, but were still subject to local rulers, who were, of course, creatures of the Persian court. Essentially, in 500 BC, one of these cities, due to corruption and cultural differences, of course, they revolted against Persia, and they were assisted by the Athenians, and they were able to get to Sardis in the interior, which is what led to the the Persian invasion of Greece. And they were defeated. Next, we have Sardis, which was an ancient city at the location of modern Sart, or Salili in Turkey. And Sardis was the ancient capital of the ancient kingdom of Lydia, which was one of the most important cities of the Persian Empire. It was also the location of one of the 7 churches of Asia, and so it's mentioned in the book of Revelation in the New Testament. So, it's kind of interesting. Next we have Karia, which was a region in the western Anatolia extending from Ionia and to South Lycia. And they were described by Herodotus as being of Minoan descent. They, of course, asserted that they were Anatolian mainlanders, but just engaged in seafaring. But they were akin to the Lydians. The Carians, as they were known, spoke Carian, which was a native Anatolian language. Karia was first incorporated into the Persian Achaemenid Empire as a satrapy in 545 BC. The most important town in Karia was Halicarnassus, which is, of course, the location of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which was one of the wonders of the world, but it is no longer. During the second Persian invasion of Greece, the cities of Karia were allies of Xerxes I, and they essentially tried to battle the Ionians from a coalition. But after the unsuccessful Persian invasion of Greece in 479, the cities of Karia became members of the Delian League. But then 1 century later, in 428, they returned to Achaemenid rule. So it really went back and forth quite a bit, and the Carians were eventually incorporated into the Macedonian Empire following the conquests of Alexander the Great and the siege of Halicarnassus in 334. I mentioned the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which is dedicated to Mausolus, a satrap of Karia between 377 and 353. And it was one of the 7 wonders of the world. And it was actually from which the Romans named any grand tomb a mausoleum. Next, we have Lydia, which was an Iron Age kingdom of Western Asia Minor, which was east of Ionia, as we mentioned, and in the modern Western Turkish provinces of Usak and Manisa and Izmir. I may have mispronounced those. They spoke the language known as Lydian, which was again an Anatolian, Indo-European language, and the capital was Sardis. This kingdom existed from 1200 BC to 546 BC. Its greatest extent in the 7th century BC. In 546 BC, it became a province of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, known as the satrapy of Lydia. In 547, the Lydian king besieged and captured the Persian city in Cappadocia, and because of this, the Persian king Cyrus the Great marched against them, and the Lydians retreated to their capital city of Sardis, in which Cyrus pursued and eventually won, and captured the city in 546. It was captured by the Sumerians in the 7th century, the Persians in the 6th, by the Athenians in the 5th, and by Antiochus III, the Great, at the end of the 3rd. So this region changed hands many times. This is the end station for the Persian Royal Road, which began at Persepolis, all the way down here, which was the capital of Persia. And again, it was the most important Persian satrapy. During the Ionian revolt, which I mentioned, the Athenians burned down the city of Sardis. It wasn't until 334 that it was surrendered to Alexander the Great. The Lydian kingdom was very advanced in the industrial arts, and Sardis was the chief seat of that manufacturing industrial power. The most important was the trade and dyeing of the delicate woolen things and carpets. The stream Pactolus, which flowed through the marketplace, carried, they say, golden sands in early antiquity, which was gold dust out of Mount Tmolus. And the metallurgists of Sardis discovered the secret of separating gold from silver, and they were able to create metals of extreme purity, which was a bit of an economic revolution. For gold nuggets were banned and mined as currency, but their purity was always suspect. An hindrance to trade. So normally these nuggets were alloys, so you could never necessarily know how much it was gold and how much was silver. So in Sardis they could mint nearly pure silver and gold coins, and therefore the value was very consistent. And this made Sardis rich and the grossest name synonymous with wealth itself. And it's this region which is known as the birthplace of modern currency. So now we have Byzantium, Byzantium is located over here. So Byzantium, our next city is known as Constantinople, and then Istanbul in today's world. And we could go into a whole world of history about this city, but for today, we're just going to say that Byzantium was colonized by Greeks from Megara in the 7th century BC and remained Greek-speaking until its conquest by the Ottomans in 1453. The origins of Istanbul, or Byzantium, are shrouded in legend. They say that a city-state near Athens, known as Megara, they founded the city. It was a man who sailed northeast across the sea. And they usually give the date of 667, according to Herodotus. It was a trading city that was, due to its location, the Black Sea's only entrance. The city was taken by the Persians at the time of the Scythian campaign in 513 BC. And King Darius I, and it was added to an administrative province. Although Achaemenid control of the city was never as stable as compared to other cities in Thrace, it was an important port on the Bosphorus for the Achaemenids. Byzantium was besieged by Greek forces during the Peloponnesian War as part of Sparta's strategy for cutting off grain supplies to Athens. And they took control, and again, it was much later that the Greeks battled over this city, and the Achaemenids were pretty much pushed out. Next we have Phrygia. Phrygia was a kingdom in the west central part of Anatolia, in what is now Asian Turkey, centered on the Sankarios River. It was a powerful empire at that time. There are two very famous Phrygian kings. Gordius, who was named for the Gordian knot, which was later cut by Alexander the Great. Midas, King Midas, who turned whatever he touched to gold. And it wasn't until the 540 BC that Phrygia passed to the Achaemenids, when Cyrus conquered Lydia. After Darius became Persian emperor in 521 BC, he remade the ancient trade route into the Persian royal road and instituted administrative reforms that included the setting up of those satrapies which I mentioned, and this was along that route. So it wasn't until Alexander took control, and once he passed, it was overrun by Celts and eventually became the province of Galatia. The former capital of Gordium was captured and destroyed by the Gauls soon afterwards and disappeared from history. Next we have Gordian, which, as I mentioned, according to tradition, it is the place where Alexander cut the Gordian knot. This was an intricate knot that tied a yoke to the pole of a Phrygian wagon that stood on the Acropolis of the city. The wagon was associated with Midas, or Gordius, or both, and connected with the dynasty's rise to power. The prophecy was that whoever could loosen the knot was destined to be the ruler
of Asia.
Gordian was the capital of Phrygia, which is located at the site of modern Yassihuyuk. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but it's about 70 to 80 kilometers southwest of Ankara, which is the capital of Turkey. It was sort of at the confluence of a couple rivers that gave it strategic location with the control over fertile land. Gordian lies where the ancient road between Lydia and Assyria or Babylonia crossed into this region. There was occupation here continuously until the 4th century, and again into the 13th and 14th centuries. There's a really interesting mound called the Citadel Mound, which is about 13.5 hectares in size, and it's quite large. This is really typical of the Phrygian civilization, and it's really a chronological linchpin in the region. There is extensive evidence for the Persian siege in 546 BC. They built the fort at, I'm going to pronounce this, but Kusuk Hoyuk. The Persian attackers built a large siege ramp to assault the fortress, a fortress which is still visible today. And that's when it became part of the satrapy of Hellesponta and Phrygia, which had a different city actually as the capital. So it essentially was relegated, but Gordian still prospered under the Achaemenids until about 500 BC. And there's a lot of beautiful frescoes and things like that showing a lot of cultic activity, and it's really interesting. Next we have Galatia, but in today's world is known as Cilicia. It's the ancient Roman name for the southeastern region of Asia Minor and Turkey. That's what we've been talking about. It's referenced in the books of Acts and Galatians in the Bible, and it is the birthplace of St. Paul and the site of his early evangelical missions. It was inhabited in the Neolithic period, 8th millennium BC. It was under Hittite control by the 2nd millennium before passing to the Assyrians and gaining its independence after the fall of the Assyrians in 612. And was then taken by the Persians, and of course then by Alexander the Great in 333 BC. And it became politically aligned with Syria, which is why some major cities such as Tarsus are often identified as Syria in ancient texts. You can see the location, it's quite close. It's Tarsus. So Tarsus, again, is sort of a part of that world. Next, we have Salamis, which is located here. It's an ancient Greek city-state on the north coast of Cyprus. It's about 6 kilometers north of modern Famagusta. The founder of Salamis was Teucer, son of Telamon, the king of the Greek island of Salamis, who could not return home after the Trojan War because he had failed to avenge his brother Ajax. In 450 BC, Salamis was the site of a simultaneous land and sea battle between the Persians and Athens. This is not to be confused with the earlier Battle of Salamis in 480. The history of Salamis during the Archaic and Classical period is reflected by the Greek historian Herodotus. It was besieged and conquered by Artaxerxes III. There was a time under King Evagoras in 411 to 374 BC when Greek culture and art flourished. And it was definitely a tumultuous place. After Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, Ptolemy of Egypt ruled the island of Cyprus. You can see it's pretty close here. Next, we have Paphos, which is a coastal city in southwest Cyprus. And in classical antiquity, two locations were known as Paphos. Old Paphos, today known as Kuklia, and New Paphos. The current city of Paphos lies on the Mediterranean coast, about 50 kilometers west of Limassol, which is the biggest port on the island. It has a subtropical Mediterranean climate with very mild temperatures on the island. Old Paphos was the center of worshipping Aphrodite for the entire Aegean world. It had a road which spanned a few miles to the sea, and was the center for Aphrodite's cult. Her birthplace was on the island, in the myths. The founding myth is interwoven with Aphrodite's hunch that Old Paphos became the most famous and important place for worshipping Aphrodite in the ancient world. Here we have Cyprus. And Cyprus in the Achaemenid period was actually the kings of this island submitted willingly to Cyrus and offered military assistance to the Persians in their campaigns against Karia and Babylon. And the island remained more or less within the Achaemenid sphere of influence until the defeat of Darius III at Issus, after which Cypriot allegiance was transferred to Alexandria of Macedon. Cyprus was reorganized. Some 10 kingdoms remained after the Achaemenids took control, and they were loyal to Persia usually and supported King Xerxes. When he tried to subject the Greek homeland in 480, Cyprus sent no less than 150 ships. Still, there was a lot of cross-cultural trade, and there was a lot of openness between the two societies. In 468, the Athenian commander Cimon tried to conquer the island, but he was able to defeat the Persian army and navy. He wasn't able to seize all of Cyprus. At the beginning of the 4th century, King Euagoras of Salamis attempted to become the sole ruler of Cyprus. At first, he tried to achieve this with Persian support, but eventually the Persians did not award Euagoras and he decided to revolt. The moment was very well chosen because the Persian Empire was severely weakened from a civil war between Artaxerxes II and his brother Cyrus the Younger. Moreover, Athens and the Egyptian king supported Euagoras as well. He managed to unite Cyprus and expanded his influence even to Phoenicia and Cilicia. Initially, Artaxerxes' response was diplomatic, and there was a peace treaty with the Greek cities in 387 BC. Athens would no longer support Cyprus. In 381, a Persian empire invaded Cyprus, and Euagoras' ships were defeated. Although he held out for some time, he was forced to sign a peace treaty in 379, keeping control of Salamis, but losing much of what he had once possessed. Persian control eventually was restored, and there was another revolt in 350 BC, which was repressed by Artaxerxes III, Ochus. But the end of Persian Cyprus was near. Next, we have Sidon, known locally as Sida, the third largest city of Lebanon, and it's the capital of the southern governorate on the Mediterranean coast, just north of Tyre. And it's very close to the capital, Beirut, which is about 40 kilometers or 25 miles away. It was one of the most important Phoenician cities, and it may have been the oldest. It was a great Mediterranean commercial empire, and like other Phoenician city-states, Sidon suffered from a succession of conquerors. First, by the Persian Achaemenid Empire in the 6th century BC, and ending with the occupation of Alexander the Great in 333 BC. And the Persian influence seems to have been quite profound, as is observed in the change of the architectural style of the city. Below this, we have the ancient city of Tyre, which is in Lebanon, and it's one of the oldest cities in the world, dating back over 4,000 years. It is one of the most important cities of the Phoenician Empire. The city was an ancient Phoenician port and industrial city, which in myth is known as the birthplace of Europa, who gave Europe its name, and Dido of Carthage, who gave aid to and fell in love with Aeneas of Troy. The Tyrians were known as workers in dye from the shells of the murex shellfish. We've talked about this actually in my Near East or Middle East video from 50 AD, but this purple dye was highly valued and held royal connotations in the ancient world. It also gave the Phoenicians their name from the Greeks, which was Phonikis, which means purple people. The city-state was the most powerful in all Phoenicia after it surpassed its city, Sidon, as I mentioned above. Tyre revived under the Persian Empire, which took the city in 539 BC and held it until Alexander the Great. Here's Damascus. Damascus really is one of the main cities of Syria today. And of course, it's been such an important city for so many empires. Damascus, really the history is unknown. The history of Syria during the Persian Achaemenid Empire is relatively poorly documented. And that is probably a result of the fact that Persian and local administrations wrote in Aramaic, mostly on perishable materials. So, Persian near Syria, and Persian Syria, which was taken in 538 to 331 BC. In 538, Cyrus the Great became master of Mesopotamia and Syria. The annexation of Syria, Palestine was peaceful at that time, according to sources, except for Gaza, which only submitted by force. It's down here. And of course, the Cyrus the Great allowed the return of the Jews to Jerusalem. And as sympathizers of Persian rule, their presence in Palestine was likely intended to balance power in a district that was mostly pro-Egyptian. Babylonian texts suggest that deported Syrians also were sent back to the Aleppo region for a similar purpose. Cyrus the Great's son, Cambyses II, occupied Egypt, but he probably died in Damascus, which of course at that time was the most important city in Syria. Darius III stored his treasures and furniture there before his battle with Alexander. Later, Syria became the fifth satrapy, which included Cyprus to the Sinai. Syria's geographic location, its forests, and its navy were of great importance for the Persians' Mediterranean projects. Even though its annual tribute was only 350 talents, a relatively moderate sum compared with Egypt's tribute of 700 talents. Under Persian rule, local Syrian dynasties were permitted to govern in different coastal cities and treated as allied subjects. So they continued to practice their own religions, their own commercial activities, and even establish colonies along the Mediterranean coast. These small Canaanite kingdoms, known as Phoenician, refused to help Cambyses, who, while in Egypt, planned to attack Carthage, their ancient colony. However, they sided with the Persians against the Greeks in the wars from 490 to 449 BC, which or from a Syrian point of view, a very good time to get rid of the Greek presence in the Mediterranean. Next, we have Samaria. This right here. And that is the name used for the central region of the land of Israel, bordered by Judea to the south and Galilee to the north. The first century historian Josephus set the Mediterranean Sea as its limit to the west, and the Jordan River as its limit to the east. The name Samaria is derived from the ancient city of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. The name Samaria likely began being used for the entire kingdom not long after the town of Samaria had become Israel's capital. But it is first documented after its conquest by Sargon II of Assyria, who turned the kingdom into the province of Samarina. According to many scholars, archaeological excavations at the Mount Gerizim indicate that a Sumerian temple was built there in the 5th century BC. The date of the schism between the Samaritans and the Jews is unknown, but by the early 4th century BC, the communities seem to have distinctive practices of communal separation. Alright, so we are on to Jerusalem, which is a very important religious and cultural center. We won't go into too much detail because we've done detailed video on ancient Jerusalem in the past, but as it relates to the Persian Empire, Jerusalem has been under its control twice in its long history. The first time was in the 6th century BCE, and the second was during the Sasanian state in the 7th century CE. During the Achaemenid period, when Cyrus took over the region, he allowed the Jewish people to return, and they rebuilt their second temple. When Alexander the Great conquered this area, of course, it came under Macedonian control. So next we're going to Gaza, which, after the exile of the Judeans, Palestine fell into obscurity until the return of the exiles under Cyrus the Great. In the 1,000 years that followed, the area was administered by imperial powers, the Persian Empire, the Ptolemaic Egyptians, the Seleucid Syrian dynasties, the Romans, the Sassanians, the Islamic conquests, and really it was after the catastrophic conquest by the Mesopotamian empires, Palestine really suffered until the revival under Persian rule. With Cyrus the Great's conquest, they essentially, they rebuilt some of those areas, and it was essentially not until the completion of the temple, but that gap between the 516 BC and after was a bit of a dark spot in terms of knowledge, but there is some details offered in the Bible. Take that as you will. The death of Darius the Great, of course, prompted revolts in these areas, but it may not be the case that they were completely affected. But that said, despite the revolts, Persian rule was maintained through most of the area. Next, we have Pelusium, or Pelusium, which was an important city in the Egypt Nile Delta, and it did become a Roman provincial capital at one time. principal product of this region was flax, and it was very abundant and of very fine quality. It's also an early producer of beer, which was known as Pelusium drink, or Pelusian drink. It was a fortress of great strength, protecting Egypt, and it was directly exposed to attack by invaders, and often besieged, but the decisive battle which transferred the throne of the pharaohs to Cambyses II was fought near here in 525 BC. As Cambyses advanced to Memphis, Pelusium probably surrendered quite quickly, but it was taken and attacked in 343 BC, but it only contained a garrison of about 5,000 Greek mercenaries. So it wasn't quite a fair battle. Next we have Memphis, which was the very important city in Egypt. It's under the protection of Ptah, the patron of craftsmen, which had a beautiful, amazing temple. The history of this city is really linked to the greater history of Egypt, and the downfall is believed to have been due to its economic significance, as the rise of coastal cities like Alexandria came to be. And of course, the religious significance was diminished after the abandonment of the religion, which was following the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 HD, which made Nicene Christianity the only religion of the Roman Empire. Memphis saw many invasions later on after that, and was besieged, but despite the support of the Greek allies, the country nevertheless fell into the hands of the Persian Empire and was never again to become the nation's capital. In 332, the Greeks took control from the Persians, and essentially that was it. So the ruins there today, of course, are a fragmented piece of its glorious past. So the one Western power that remained unconquered during Cyrus's time was Egypt, and that was finished by Cambyses in 525 BC. And after a 10-day siege, Egypt's ancient capital fell to the Persians. Next we have Sais, and Sais was the location of the chief shrine of Neith, who was the goddess of war and of the loom. It became relatively important late in its history because it changed back and forth between the Kushites and Libyan prince and essentially Assyrians as well. So the modern site mound, which is burial mound of some sort, has been very little explored, and unfortunately it's been pilfered to some degree. But all that remains of this once great city is inscribed stones. The modern settlement produces primarily cotton. So we have Egypt here, and of course you know it today, but the Achaemenid conquest of Egypt took place in 525, which led to the 27th dynasty of Egypt, which was the first Egyptian satrapy. And so Egypt became a province of the Achaemenid Persian Empire until 404 BC. And as I said, this was led by Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, who defeated them at the Battle of Pelusium, as we see here, in 525 BCE. And he crowned himself as Pharaoh of Egypt. So, essentially, there was a second period of Achaemenid rule between 343 and 332, sort of towards the end of the Persian Empire. So now we have Libya, which is the area that corresponds with the eastern Libyan region. And according to King Darius of Persia and King Xerxes, that's sort of the general location. And it is mentioned as being part of a Greek colony, which was controlled by the Persians. When Cambyses conquered Egypt, the king of this area, he sided with the Persians, and he was killed trying to maintain power. So essentially a competing dynasty invited the Persians to take the region. And so they came, and with an expedition that lasted nearly a year, they subjugated the Libyans. And they actually penetrated as far west as Benghazi. And a puppet king was installed named Darius IV. And that's really when it was made into a Persian satrapy. And there is some discussions that say that the region gained independence with the rebellion of Egypt in 404 BC, but either way, the Achaemenid control of the region was lost after Alexander's conquests. Next we have Cyrene, which we just spoke about, but it's near the present-day city of Shahat, Libya. It was one of the oldest and most important of the 5 Greek cities known as the Pentapolis, which is in that region. I don't know a lot about that particular grouping of Greek cities, but perhaps it would be a great video in the future. It gave eastern Libya the classical name of Cyrenaica, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but it has retained that to modern times. The founder of the city was Bottas, the Lacedaemonian, and although there's a bit of a question about the relationship between the fledgling city and other neighboring cities, there's a lot of thoughts that there's a mother city and relationships with cities such as Sparta and Samnium merchants as well. Cyrene lies in a lush valley, and it was named after a spring, Karia, which the Greeks consecrated to Apollo. It became the home of a famous school for philosophy, which was founded by a disciple of Socrates. Alright, now let's move over this way here. We have Arabia, which was a satrapy, a province, which corresponds to the lands between the Nile Delta and Egypt and Mesopotamia. So again, it's not quite exact with the modern region that we think of, but this was known to the Romans as Arabia Petraea. So when Cambyses came through, he did not subdue the Arabs, but it was his successor, the Darius the Great, who mentions from his first years in reign, and this suggests that Darius might have conquered this part of Arabia, or that it was originally part of another province, perhaps Achaemenid Babylonia. but later became its own province. The Arabs were not considered as subjects to the Achaemenids as other people were, and they were exempt from taxation. Instead, they simply provided 1,000 talents of frankincense a year, which was a valuable commodity. I did talk a little bit about the history of frankincense in my essential oils video, which is really interesting, the trade in that region. They also helped the Achaemenids invade Egypt by providing water skins to the troops crossing the desert. And they were enrolled in the general army and, in fact, participated in the invasion of Greece. And many of the Arab soldiers in the service of the Achaemenids are depicted in the reliefs of the imperial tombs in Persepolis and other areas. Next, we have Babylonia. Babylonia came into being in the 2nd millennia BC and lasted until it was conquered in 539 by the Persians. It's an ancient Akkadian-speaking state, and really it's present-day Iraq and parts of Syria. It was merely a small provincial town during the Akkadian Empire. In 2100 BC. It greatly expanded during the reign of Hammurabi in the first half of the 18th century and then became a major capital city. It was called the country of Akkad, and again gave reference to the previous glory of the Akkadian Empire. It was often involved in rivalry with the older state of Assyria to the north, and the Elams to the east. But essentially, it rapidly fell apart after the death of Hammurabi and reverted to a small kingdom. For the early history of Babylonia, supreme administrative power belonged to the Persian satrap. The first governor of the city of Babylon was Cyrus's general, Ukubaro, who in effect held power over the whole of Mesopotamia. Ukubaro died 3 weeks after the capture of Babylon, and in 538, Cyrus appointed his own son, Cambyses, as king of Babylonia, keeping control of the rest of the empire for himself. Babylonia was the richest satrapy under the Achaemenid rule, paying 1,000 talents, or about 30 tons of silver, to the Persian kings annually, as well as 500 boys to serve at court as eunuchs. In addition, the Babylonians were required to maintain the army stationed in their country, and for 4 months of the year to provide provisions for the king and his entourage. There also are many reliefs of Babylonians among the tributary people bringing woven garments, vases, and vessels on the reliefs in Persepolis. And eventually Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 333 BC for the Greeks, and he died there in 323 BC. Babylon was the capital city of that empire, the Babylonian Empire, which, as I said, was 2 separate empires in antiquity. And they really achieved dominance in the 19th and 15th century BC, and then again in the 7th and 6th. The city was built along the Euphrates River and had steep embankments to contain the river's seasonal floods. The earliest known mention of Babylon as a small town appears on a clay tablet from the reign of Sargon of Akkad
2300 BC. So again, it was part of the Akkadian Empire. The site of the ancient city lies just south of present-day Baghdad. The last known record of habitation of the city dates from the 10th century AD, when it was a small village of Babel. The Babylonian history, really, with the Persian, starts with Cyrus. And in the beginning, it had a more hostile attitude as a captured city. Cyrus apparently ordered the outer walls to be destroyed to render the city less formidable. But there are conflicting stories, and although they mostly affirm that the Babylonians resisted, and the capital was taken after fierce fighting, Herodotus says the Babylonians stalked for the siege to last several years, but the Persians demolished one of the dikes and diverted the waters of the Euphrates at the point when it entered Babylon. So they took the city by surprise. The Persians put out meticulously coordinated propaganda. They present Cyrus as the liberator of the land from its oppression under Nabonidus, while they say Nabonidus despised the gods in his own country and committed crimes against the temples, and even plundered the possessions of others. The Achaemenids spent part of the year in Babylon, laid out gardens with pavilions, and there are many fragments showing various inscriptions showing this, and Cyrus achieved this by consolidating his power through the nobility, by maintaining their position and essentially enriching the equivalent of a oligarchy or monarchy, and giving them money. So that always works. The Babylonians were said to wear turbans and perfume and bury their dead in honey, and interestingly, 3 of the tribes among them eat nothing but fish. Next we move to Mesopotamia, which we've talked about previously, but it was also called Assyria. And it was in the Achaemenid Empire for most of the time that it existed, and for most of the time the Achaemenid Empire existed. And it was considered a satrapy, but it is listed a bit differently. It's sort of considered to be a part of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, or what was once the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And that's what is now northern Iraq and the upper Tigris River. The upper middle Euphrates and parts of modern-day northwestern Iran, Syria, and Anatolia in Turkey. So, the Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed after a period of violent civil wars, followed by an invasion by a coalition of some of its subject people, the Iranians, the Medes, Persians, and Scythians, Babylonians, Sumerians, and it really cultivated in the Battle of Nineveh, which essentially was the collapse of the empire by 609 BC. And it's a very dramatic story that I think we may visit in a future video. Between 609 and 559 BC, the former Assyrian territories were divided between the Medians to the east and the Neo-Babylonian Empire to the west. And again, the Assyrians were considered to be bloodthirsty, so there was very little remorse as they divvied up the empire. The inhabitants were given the right to govern themselves, actually.
the language of diplomacy at this time was Old Aramaic, probably similar to the way that French is considered the language of diplomacy, sort of today in the Victorian era as well, in the 20th century. So known for their combat skills, the Assyrian soldiers, as well as the Lydians, constituted the main heavy infantry of the Achaemenid military. Known for their combat skills, Assyrian soldiers, along with the Lydians, constituted the main heavy infantry of the Achaemenid military. Due to the major destruction of Assyria during the fall of its empire, some early scholars describe the area as an uninhabited wasteland. However, there are a lot of disputes to that claim, and they say it was one of the wealthiest regions among the Achaemenid Empire. And this wealth was due to the land's great prosperity for agriculture that the Achaemenids used effectively for almost 200 years. And in contrast to the Assyrians, the Achaemenids did not intervene in internal affairs of their satrapies as long as the money flowed. The former major cities of the Assyrians were sparsely populated during Achaemenid rule. Most of them were smaller cities, towns, and villages in the mountains or on mounds. But some of the cities remained intact, like Arbela, which we'll look at up here. But that said, rural Assyria was prosperous, and that's according to Greek scholar Xenophon. So that is something that's interesting. They say there was an abundance of corn in the villages, and there was a palace, beautiful palace with many villages about it. And there was an abundance of provisions, flour, wine, and great stores of barley that had been collected for horses. All of these supplies were from that local region, so it was a testimony to how rich the region was prior to the Persian rule of Assyria. The Achaemenids were greatly Assyrianized, so this is similar to the way that many countries have adopted the culture of the United States, or how France was sort of that way in the 19th and early 20th century, or in the Roman times, the way they viewed the Greeks. So Aramaic was the language of diplomacy and of the imperial script and everyday writing system. The traditional Mesopotamian religion was tolerated, as well as the judicial and system in the calendar. So a lot of the standards they had created remained in effect. The Assyrians, like many of the other tributary people of the Achaemenids, were obliged to pay taxes to the emperor whenever he campaigned and supplied troops. The Assyrians didn't have to pay tribute like the others, and there are many reliefs of Assyrian tribute bearers carved on in Persian reliefs. So they are portrayed as bearded men with animal skins and a length of cloth, or carrying two bowls. So that's sort of interesting. Even before the empire fell, the Assyrians made Aramaic language the main language of the empire, and many could speak it. They could speak Akkadian and Aramaic, so essentially the elite had to be able to speak that, and really this whole region lived under that culture. So following the Achaemenid conquest, Darius I adopted Imperial Aramaic as the vehicle for written communication between the empires. Here's another Babylonian city. This is called Opis. It's not too far from modern Baghdad. The texts say it's located east of the Tigris. Tigris River. But the precise location is a bit unknown. It's at one point thought to be near or under the city of Seleucia. But it has recently been identified with a mound, which is about 20 miles southeast from Baghdad, or about 76 kilometers northeast of Babylon. The Babylonians dug a royal canal between the Euphrates and the Tigris, which ended near Opis. There was a wall that protected this region. It was between the two rivers to protect against a Median invasion. The line continued beyond the Tigris and ended near Opis, as I said. In 539, the Babylonian troops, led by Nabonidus, defended Opis against the Persians and Cyrus the Great, but they were defeated, and the native population revolted against its own government. As I said, there was a huge propaganda campaign that portrayed Cyrus as the liberator. So he captured Babylon, as I said, and Opis was, as you can see here, we haven't spoken about this yet, but it's near the Royal Road, which connects the former Elamite capital here at Susa and essentially it's really was stayed in control by the Persians. Actually, this road really leads all the way to Lydia. We're going to talk more about it shortly. So it was eventually taken by Alexander as he moved across. And now we move a bit north here to Comana, which is a ancient city located in modern Turkey, and it's called Pontus, this region. They've made some excavations here and found some outer walls, but it really was known as Comana until the Roman times, much later. There was a temple there, and it was a self-governing kingdom. It had a lot of drama in the Roman times, much later. But of course it was taken by Alexander the Great much later in time. It was renamed actually as Comana Pontica, so that's, if you look for it, you have to look under that name to see more information. So, that said, let's move on to the next one, which is Mazaka. And it's the current day city of Kayseri in Turkey. It's a very important city in the Cappadocia region, and it was the crossroads of the trade routes between Sinope, which is up here and we'll talk about it, to the Euphrates down here, and from the Persian Royal Road, and it extended from Sardis to Susa. And the Roman times, a similar route also crossed through the city. It's stands on a low spur on the north side of a mount, so there's only a few traces from ancient times. Here we have Cappadocia, which is the current region of Cappadocia. And since the 300s BC, the Cappadocia was restricted to the inland province. But it was known as Hatti in the Bronze Age, and it was the homeland of the Hittites at Hattusa. And after the fall of the Hittites and their defeat by the Lydian king, King Croesus in the 6th century, it was ruled by a feudal aristocracy. Dwelled in large castles and kept the peasants in a servile condition, which later made them apt to foreign slavery, unfortunately. And so this was included in the Third Persian satrapy, which was established by Darius, but it continued to be ruled by local leaders. So they were, of course, tributaries to Persia. Now, Cappadocia is also the name of a province used by the Achaemenid Empire to administer these entire regions here. And they paid an estimated 360 talents a year. There's not a lot known about the leadership. However, at one point it was ruled by Gordius, the half-brother of Xerxes, who we've spoken about. During the reign of Artaxerxes II, Cappadocia was split, and that's kind of the beginning of this whole sort of split up and mix up and shake up that constantly happened in this region. And obviously there was leaders from the Achaemenid Empire till about 334, in which they lost, of course, to Alexander's invading army. So let me move this down here. You can see here we have, this is Sinope, which is near Cape, and it's situated on the northernmost edge of the Turkish side of the Black Sea coast. It's the capital of this province in the modern times. It's had a history of about 2,500 years. And of course, as you know, this region was influenced by Greeks, Turkic people, Romans, and also people who settled from the Balkans and the Caucasus. Strategically located among the trade routes that were developing on that southern coast here. As you can see, the Royal Road kind of connects all of this. And there is a lot of mythical connections between this area and Jason and the Argonauts. There was an increase in economic activity here in the port surrounding the inland areas between the 4th and 1st century BC. It is said that it maintained a level of independence from Alexander the Great. Again, this was a Hittite area, and there's a lot of ongoing research, so it's still sort of murky. So there's a lot of debate surrounding whether the Hittites actually did move this far north, and the research is somewhat conflicting, but essentially that's sort of the Sinope of the time. I'm probably mispronouncing that one as well. Might be Sinope. Sinope, I'm not sure. So now we have this really interesting thing here, which is the Royal Road. And again, this was fairly groundbreaking and similar to how the Romans built huge roadways for the quick travel. This was an ancient highway that was built by Darius the Great in the 5th century BC. It facilitated quick travel from Sardis in Lydia to Susa. The mounted couriers of the postal service that they had at that time, this road was about 1,677 miles long. So it took about 9 days to make that journey on foot. So it wasn't the shortest or the easiest route between these big cities, and there's evidence that the original road was built by the Assyrian kings, because it, as you can see here, plunges into the heart of the old empire. In present-day Iran, a lot of the road was not noted by Herodotus. Many stretches of the Royal Road correspond to the silk trade route that is very famous as a trade route between the East and the West. But Darius improved the road network to help deliver messages to the Persian capital. The Romans improved the road at one point with a hard-packed gravel surface. So they unified a lot of this road as a primary road here. So there would be supplies of fresh horses and mounted messengers. Darius was really instrumental in improving the quality of the road to such a degree that it continued to be used until Roman times. In fact, there is a bridge that stands in Turkey from this period. This road really helped Persia increase its long-distance trade, which, as we know, reached its peak right before Alexander. The road was secured by guard posts, so patrols would walk this route to make sure it was secure. And it really was a monument ultimately to the Persian Empire. Next, we have Armenia, which was a satrapy at this time. This region was once controlled by the Orantid dynasty in 570 to 201 BC. And again, it was a satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire, and it later became an independent kingdom. It was a kingdom called Urartu, also known as Ararat, and they collapsed, and the Medians took control, as well as the Scythians. Later, the territory was conquered by the Achaemenids, and that's why they named it the land of Armenia. And that's kind of its origins at that time, and it was from 553 to 521 that Armenia became a subject kingdom to the Achaemenids. But when Darius became the king, he conquered it officially, and there were revolts there and the changes of leadership due to the unrest. And eventually, the demise of the Achaemenids led to an incorporation of Armenia into Alexander the Great's new empire. Following the demise of the Achaemenid Empire, the satrapy of Armenia was incorporated into Alexander's empire. So now we have our next city, Kazaka. Kazaka is the Greek form for the name Ganzak, which is the name in Persian or English. It was an ancient town in northwestern Iran, and it stood south of Lake Urmia, of course the older boundaries of Lake Urmia. And it has been postulated that a Persian nobleman named Atropathes chose the capital as a city, kind of get away from the center of power here. The word means treasury, and it is of Median origin, which was adopted into Persian by the Achaemenid Empire. So it was built up by the Achaemenids, and it was the seat of the satrap of Media. During the 4th century BC, the city became the domain of that Persian aristocrat who I mentioned, who had deserted to Alexander the Great and decided to make this his capital. And it was really called the Kingdom of Atropathes, or Atropatene, but again, that all changed as the balance of power shifted many, many times in this region over the years after. Of course, this is only 500 BC or so. And that leads us to our next town of Arbela, also known as Erbil. And it's kind of, again, had a bunch of name changes, but it's the capital and most populated city in Kurdistan, Iraq. It's a large city, currently has over 1 million people. Human settlement at Arbela, or Erbil, At the heart of the city is the ancient citadel of Erbil. There are references to the region in the third dynasty of Sumer. The city was later conquered by Assyrians, and it was under their geopolitical province, but changed hands many times, from the Medians to the Achaemenids, the Macedonians, the Seleucians, the Armenians, Parthians, Roman Assyria, and Sasanian Empire. It has a very diverse city, and today a Kurdish majority, but also Turkmens, Assyrians, Arabs, and Armenians. It's a very religiously diverse city as well, with Sunni Islam, Shia, Christianity, the Yazidis, and many others. It was under the Median tribe when the ancient Iranian tribes of the Circassians came and essentially were rewarded the region as help, as a reward for their capture of Nineveh. So, Cyrus the Great initially occupied this region in 547 BC. And as I said, he established the satrapy with Babylon as the capital. When Alexander invaded, it was in 331 BC where the actual defeat of Darius III of Persia took place. It was about 62 miles west of Erbil. And initially after the battle, Darius managed to flee. And that really when it became part of Alexander's empire. Next we have Media, which is a region of northwestern Iran. And it was the political and cultural base of the Medes, who controlled this region before the Achaemenids. It is a kind of a modern-day Azerbaijan, the Iranian Kurdistan, and it was a satrapy under the Achaemenid rule, as I mentioned. It actually stretched to Dagestan in the north as well. But after the wars of Alexander the Great, the northern parts were separated due to the partition of Babylon, which was what I said, the noble from Persia who came and fled to Alexander, and essentially that he took that land. In 553, Cyrus the Great rebelled against his grandfather, the Median king, Astyages. He won his decisive victory in 550 BC, resulting in Astyages' capture by his own noblemen, in which Cyrus was triumphant. In the new empire, the Medes retained a prominent position. In honor and war, they stood next to the Persians, and in fact, their court ceremony was adopted by the Achaemenids, who, in the summer months, resided in Ecbatana. Many noble Medes were employed as officials, satraps, and generals, and in fact, contemporary sources referred to the Achaemenids as a Median empire. There were many troublesome uprisings in this region under Darius the Great, and later in 409 BC under Darius II, but they were essentially put under control by the Achaemenid Empire. You can see here, but the satrap, which was the 11th satrapy, was split in two between Ecbatana and Media, the greater Median region. Also worth noting is the Caucasian Albania, which comprises the modern-day Azerbaijan and southern Dagestan. And as the Persian Empire decayed, these mountainous tribes became independent. It's also worth noting that the Medians were the first Iranian empire. In 678, before the Achaemenids, it was united under the Median tribes, and all of the Iranians and the Iranian tribal people came together, and it became a major power. And Astyages, who I mentioned before, was the last king of the Median Empire. And that brings us to the next city, which was Ecbatana, which we've mentioned in some of the previous cities, but this was the ancient city in Media, which is believed to be a mound in terms of where it is today. It was chosen in the late 8th century BC. As I mentioned, they united all of the tribes of Iran. Under the Achaemenids, Ecbatana again was a summer residence at the foot of a beautiful mountain. And later it became the king's choice city under the Parthians, in which they produced several minting of coins, bronze denominations particularly. And really the wealth and importance of the city in the Persian Empire is due to the location as a crossroads, which made it a staging post between the east and west highway. The Greeks thought Ecbatana was the capital of the Medes, and again it was apparently surrounded by 7 concentric walls of different colors, so it must have been quite a sight to behold. The next city on our list is Gabai. Gabai, or also known as Gabe, is mentioned several sources, but Three, two, one. Gabai, or also known as Gabe, is not very well known, but it is mentioned in several sources. It is occupied by Isfahan, which is one of the largest metropolises in Iran. And it's a huge city, so it's unlikely they'll be able to dig underneath it to find those things, those ruins. But that said, it was likely to be an equally important town in antiquity because it is located on the Zayande route, which is a river, major water source. As you can see here, there it is, for travelers to halt and was a quite agriculturally rich place. So they absolutely would pass through the city because of its location through several main roads. It was across the Zagros to Susa and Elam, to Ecbatana, north, along the desert, to near modern Tehran, up here, across the Zagros to Susa and Elam, to Ecbatana in Bardiya, along the desert to modern Tehran, which was under a different name at that time, to Persis, to the south. And of course it connects these important cities here, which we'll talk about: Pasargadae, Persepolis, Shiraz, and of course to the Persian Gulf as well. In the spring of 330, Alexander the Great pursued the last Achaemenid king, Darius III, who passed through Gabai. And the fact that it is mentioned means it did exist in the Achaemenid times. And during the Parthian times, much later, it was a provincial capital, and essentially it received its modern name of Isfahan during the Sasanian rule. And of course, like all of the cities, this is an ancient place that has origins in the Elamite times during the time of 2700 to 1600 BC. And that leads us to our next, which is this one here, Arya. Arya was a Achaemenid region centered on the city of Herat in present-day Afghanistan. It was an old Persian satrapy, and again was on the valley of a river. In antiquity, it was considered particularly fertile and above all rich in wine. The Persian Achaemenid district of Arya is mentioned in the provincial lists that are included on various royal descriptions. They are shown in Persian reliefs, wearing a Scythian-style dress with tunic and trousers tucked into high boots and a twisted turban around the head. And that brings us to Susa. Susa was an ancient city in the lower Zagros Mountains, east of the Tigris, in Iran. It was one of the most important cities in the ancient Near East. It was a capital of Elam and the Achaemenids, as well as a strategic center during the Parthian and Sasanian periods. The site is currently 3 archaeological mounds, which again there's much to discover in current archaeological excavations. The modern Iranian town of Shush is located on the site of ancient Susa. Shush is identified as Shushan in the Book of Esther in the Bible. When Susa became a part of the Persian Empire between 540 and 539,
captured by Cyrus the Great.
Susa underwent a major
transition when it became part of the Persian Empire between 540 and 539 BC when Cyrus the Great captured it.
And he led his conquest of Elam. Susa was the capital. It's probable that conflict began there much earlier than this because there's a lot of
evidence in contemporary sources to suggest there was defensive precautions being taken prior to the invasion in 540.
It's probable that Cyrus negotiated
with the Babylonian generals to obtain a compromise to avoid armed confrontation.
Nabonidus was staying in
the city at the time and soon fled to Babylon.
When Cyrus took over
Susa, the rest of Babylonia commenced a huge shift.
Under Cyrus's son Cambyses, Susa became one of the centers
of political power as one of the 4 capitals of the Achaemenid Persian Empire,
which reduced the influence of Pasargadae as the capital
of Persis, which we'll talk about in a few moments.
Darius the Great began a major building project
in Persepolis and Susa,
which included a new palace. Many of the events mentioned in the Old Testament Book of Esther
are said to have occurred in Susa during the Achaemenid period.
After Alexander invaded in 331
BCE, the city was renamed and lost much of its importance.
Today, the ancient center
of Susa is unoccupied, with, as I said, the population living in the adjacent modern town of Shush to the west and the north of the historic ruins.
Now we have Persepolis, which was the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenids. It's really about 60 kilometers from modern-day Shiraz, but the earliest remains of Persepolis come from about 515 BC. The complex is raised high on a walled platform with 5 palaces of varying size
and grand entrances.
The function of Persepolis is a bit unclear because it wasn't one of the largest cities in Persia or
the rest of the empire, but
the best way to think of it is as a grand ceremonial complex
that was only occupied seasonally.
But it's not quite clear where the king's private quarters actually were. Many archaeologists had held that it was the place for celebrating Nowruz, the Persian New Year,
which is still an important festivity, but
it is said that many Iranian nobility and tributaries came to present gifts to the king, which is represented in the reliefs. It's also unclear what permanent structures were outside of the palace complex. Gray limestone was the main building material
that was used at Persepolis.
After the terrace was prepared, there was a major development of tunnels for sewage underground, cut through the rocks. The large, elevated water storage tank, which was carved at the eastern foot of the mountain. There's been suggestion that this began all at once, as again, this may have not been a heavily populated area before the area was built up. It is said that Persepolis had 3 walls with ramparts, which all had towers to give defense to these areas, and the first wall was 23 feet tall. The second was 46 feet tall, and the third wall was 27 meters, or 89 feet in height, although there is no archaeological evidence or presence of the wall. Just in terms of they haven't found the walls, but there is evidence in the contemporary sources. The complex was taken by the army of Alexander in 330 BC. The wooden parts were completely destroyed by fire. It was Cyrus the Great who chose the site of Persepolis, but Darius built up the terraces and palaces. So there's many inscriptions here that indicate Darius constructed many of these buildings. Persepolis probably became the capital of Persia proper during his reign, however. It was located in a remote and mountainous region, which made it inconvenient as a residence for rulers of the empire. So, again, the country's true capitals were Susa, Babylon, Ecbatana, and again, that's why the Greeks really didn't write a lot about Persepolis. It wasn't until Alexander the Great took and plundered it. Essentially, Alexander sent his main force by the royal road, and on his way, he essentially went down, and there's a lot of propaganda that went back and forth, but essentially he decided to destroy it, and he saw it in a negative light because of his encounter with the Greek artisans along the way. During the invasion, there was heavy casualties inflicted on both sides, and initially they held for 30 days, but eventually Alexander the Great outflanked them and destroyed the defenders. Many of the sources indicate that the Persians were betrayed by a captured tribal chief who showed them a way to outflank them. Kind of a reversal of Thermopylae. Around that time, a fire burned the palaces, and it is mentioned in contemporary sources. Essentially, a fire spread from the living quarters of Xerxes I, and then spread to the rest of the city. It's not quite clear if it was an accident or on purpose, but the legend says that it might have been a deliberate act of revenge for the burning of the Acropolis of Athens during the Second Persian invasion of Greece. Many historians say that while Alexander's army celebrated, they decided to take revenge. And essentially that led to the complete construction of Persepolis. And it really became, or that destruction became a symbol of the destruction of the Persian Empire and resistance. Next, we have Persis, which is the region in Fars region. And it's essentially an area where Persians are thought to have initially migrated either from Central Asia or through the Caucasus. And they would have migrated to this region in about the first millennia BC. In fact, the country's name, Persia, was derived directly from the Old Persian of Parsa. So the ancient Persians were very much present in this region over thousands of years, since the 10th century BC. Again, it's the approximate name of modern Fars in central Iran. In 316 BC, Persepolis was still the capital of Persia as a province of the Macedonian Empire. But over time, as the city declined gradually, the area fell into ruins and out of favor. As I said, Persis was the Persian homeland, a land of river basins and plateaus stretching forth from the Zagros Mountains. It was a complex web of irrigation ditches, fertile valleys, and agriculture. Again, there was many hills and valleys that received different microclimates of rain, and you could find oaks, date palms, and pomegranates in this region. Also, which we'll talk about next, is the early capital, Pasargadae, which was next to Persepolis, a very famous area. You can also see here this lake, which is the North Salt Lakes, which again was the ancient seat of power here in this region of Cyrus the Great. So now we're at Pasargadae, which was the capital of the Achaemenids under Cyrus, and he ordered its construction, and it is also the location of his tomb. It's about 90 kilometers to the northeast of modern Shiraz. It was founded in the 6th century BCE by Cyrus, and it was near the site of his victory over the Median king Astyages in 550 BCE. It remained the Achaemenid capital until Darius moved it to Persepolis. It is an archaeological site, about 2 square kilometers, and it includes a structure which is commonly believed to be the mausoleum of Cyprus. There's a hill with that is on their eastern edge of the palace area, and there's a gate as well, which is the oldest structure there. And again, it may have been the early predecessor to the Gate of All Nations in Persepolis. So like I said, the most important monument here is the Tomb of Cyrus, which has 6 broad steps leading to the sepulchre, the chamber which is 3 by 2 by 2 meters and has a very low and narrow entrance. Though there is no evidence identifying this as the tomb of Cyrus, Greek historians say that Alexander believed it was. When he looted Persepolis, he visited the tomb of Cyrus, recording that he entered the monument and found a golden bed, a table set with drinking vessels, a gold coffin, some ornaments studded with precious stones, an inscription on the tomb. However, no trace of any such inscription survives. And of course, the exact wording of the text is in disagreement. So the next city here is Artaxerxes, which was the name of the capital of Aria, which we spoke about, in the eastern satrapy of the Persian Empire. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great took over this area, and a new capital was built, either by Alexander or his successor. So it's essentially near Herat in northwestern Afghanistan. Next we have Sogdianus, which was an ancient Iranian tribe that dwelled in the Iranian plateau. Their exact location is not quite known, but they were neighbors of the Parthians in northwestern Iran. And according to Herodotus, they were related to Persians, but may have entered a political union with the Medes. There are claims that they're connected to the Medians, but also there is some evidence that there was a peninsula in the Caspian Sea called Sargatia, and they were nomadic pastoralists, and their main weapon was the lasso. It's not exactly clear if they're identical to a group mentioned by Sargon II as inhabitants of the northern Zagros in the late 8th century BC, but they may have been granted this district by a Median king. And it could have been a reward for their capture of Nineveh. But the Sargatians belonged to the 14th satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire, and they do appear as a delegation among the tribute bearers on reliefs. And they are mentioned also by Herodotus as providing 8,000 horsemen for King Xerxes' massive army during the Persian king's invasion of Greece in 480 BC. Now, many Persians and Elamites mixed in the region during the Achaemenid period, and many Elamites inhabited around this area in the Zagros Mountains. Herodotus lists the Carmanians as a group of people who had settled and abandoned nomadic life to take part in agriculture, as opposed to many of the other groups that practice nomadic pastoralism one of those nomadic tribes was the Sogdians, who were also in Carmania, but they inhabited the desert part of the region. Carmania was also home to the Pasargadae tribe, clearly where this city got its name, and they were known as turtle eaters. They were non-Iranians, which inhabited the coast during Alexander's times. So now we can see the city of Karmana. So Karmana is another spelling of Karman or Kerman, which is a satrapy of Karmania, and it's the capital of the Kerman province of Iran. So there isn't a lot of information about this city, but clearly is one of the main cities of Karmania. Next we have Frada, which is here. Frada is known in modern times as Farah, and at that time it was also known as the citadel of Alexander. And Alexander the Great invaded the area, but it was the Trangian capital, and it was renamed in October of 330. But it corresponds to modern Farah in Afghanistan, which fell under the satrapy of Arya and was one of its key cities. Now we're going to go to Gedrosia, which became famous when Alexander the Great tried to cross the desert and lost 1/3 of his men. During the march home, there was a lot of reports of a dry and mountainous region inhabited by a fish-eating people. 3, 2, 1. So they're a people of the Baluchistan coast, and the area was conquered by Cyrus the Great, although information about his campaign here is relatively sparse and late. The capital of Gedrosa was Pura, which was essentially identical to modern Bhampur, which is about 40 kilometers west of Iran Shah. Many have argued that the Persian satrapy of Makkah is identical to Gedrosa. So this is Pura here. And again, it's known as Iran Shah. And it's the capital of Iran Shah County in the Sistan and Baluchistan province. Again, it has had several name changes, which means essentially defense in Persian, but it was changed to Iran Shah by Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1941. It's also the site where Alexander the Great celebrated and regrouped his troops after the Indian conquests. There's a fort called Bhampur Fort, which is located nearby. So now we have Bardiya, which was a major political and cultural power made famous by the Parthian Empire from 247 BC to 224 AD. At its height, the Parthian Empire stretched from the Euphrates to Turkey to Afghanistan and Pakistan. The empire is located on the Silk trade route, and they largely adopted the art, architecture, and religious beliefs of the Persians
and regional cultures. So there was a moment when it adopted Greek, but it saw a gradual revival of Iranian traditions.
Next we have Zandakarta, which is the provincial capital of the Mazandaran province and
A former capital of Iran,
it's located in the north of Iran,
between the northern slopes of the Alborz Mountains and the southern coast of the Caspian Sea.
So his name was Zandakarta with a C in 658 BC, but it was the largest city of Hyrcania. It means yellow city because of the great number of orange, lemon, and other fruit trees that grew on the outskirts of the city. So we have now Hyrcania, which is a historical region near the Caspian Sea in modern-day Iran and Turkmenistan, bound in the south by the Alborz Mountains. The region served as a satrapy of the Median Empire and a sub-province of the Achaemenids. And of course it changed hands between the Seleucids, the Arsacids, and the Sasanians. Hyrcania bordered Parthia and Media to the south here. It formed part of the Median Empire by 600 BC, but the region willingly submitted to the Achaemenids under Cyrus in 549 BC, and it continued to be a satrap for many, many generations. So even though there was a lot of rebel attacks and uprising, they participated in the second Persian invasion of Greece in 480. And there was a garrison composed in the region here. And under Xerxes, it was likely detached from the satrapy of Parthia. Now, the ancient Dahi country was located in a different area, but it's in the east of today's Uzbekistan. However, they are connected because, again, the people from medieval Dagestan came from Dahi, so there was a lot of migrations here, back and forth, and again had a very big religious connection with Zarathustra and Zoroastrianism. So Dahi is mentioned in the book of Yasna, which the Avestan book of Yasna. So again, that's related to Zoroastrianism, and so we know that it exists. And it's mentioned in the inscription of the Persian king Xerxes. And again, it's a bit of a complicated inscription, but it is listed as a nation of devil worshippers, so that's kind of interesting. But this list is, again, it's listed as a Scythian land. So Herodotus does reference Dahi and says they were allies of the Cyrus the Great when he sought to revolt against the Median Astyages king. And essentially they were one of the groups allied to him, and that's pretty much it. So it's kind of obscure references. Next we have Khwarezmia, which Khwarezmia was part of the Achaemenid Empire before 522 BC, and it was ruled by the satrap of Parthia. So Khwarezmia became part of the Achaemenid Empire in 522 and was ruled by the satrap of Parthia. It's in modern Kazakhstan, and it was surrounded by defensive walls 15 meters thick, with an Achaemenid-style palace as well. The Persian exit began in the 4th century, and by the time of Persian King Darius III, it was already an independent kingdom. So there was a peace treaty with Alexander, and essentially it was left to its own devices. And it corresponds to the modern area of Khwarezm, which I don't know a lot about that area. It has a desert in the south and a plateau in the west. And again, it was a series of kingdoms in this region. Like Sogdiana, it was an expansion of the Bactria, Margiana culture of the Bronze Age, which later fused with Indo-Iranians around 1000 BC. The Achaemenids took control during the reign of Cyrus in the 6th century BC, and certainly by the time of Darius. The son of Cyrus became the governor of the region along with Bactria, Carmania, and other eastern provinces of the empire. So a lot of the material culture of this area was mentioned and influenced by the Achaemenids. They sent soldiers to the second Persian invasion of Greece by Xerxes in 480 BC. But later on they were part of the satrap of Phrygia. But they were an independent kingdom, as I said, by the time of Darius, so there was a fading influence. Next we have Margiana, which is known by the ancient Greeks as the sources in the mountains of Afghanistan and of the rivers which flow to the north, and disappears into a fertile delta. So it was really occupied by farmers in 2200 to 1700 BC, and it is known as the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. So there's a lot of traditions, Hindu, Parsi, and Arab traditions, but it's identified with an ancient paradise. It was conquered by Cyrus, but it is implied and not necessarily referenced. They say it was conquered by Cyrus between 545 and 539 and remained a part of the satrapy of Bactria. There were a lot of revolts in this area as well, and they were suppressed heavily. And it is claimed that many perished during these revolts, but it was separated much later from Bactria and joined with the satrapy of Arya at some point during the rule of Darius the Great. It was also where it was along the Silk Road and kind of where the Alexander defeated Darius III. It was in that region. Next we have Amargos, which was an area inhabited by Thracians, Dacians, Celts, and it's in the modern Serbian day of Posarivac. Next we have Massage Time, which they were a tribal confederation on the steppes of Central Asia. And they're in modern Turkmenistan, western Uzbekistan, and southern Kazakhstan. They were part of the wider Scythian culture, and again it was the Massagetae queen of Tomyris, who was very famous, who defeated and killed Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenids. They offered a treaty of peace via the marriage of Cyrus to the queen Tomyris, but Tomyris turned down the offer and he attempted to advance, and unfortunately that was the end. Sogdiana is located in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and it is listed on inscriptions during the times of Darius the Great. Cyrus conquered Sogdiana while campaigning in Central Asia in 546 to 539 BC. It was actually Darius who introduced through this area the Aramaic writing system and coin currency to Central Asia, and many of the Sogdian soldiers were included in the invasion of Greece in 480 BC with Xerxes. Also, there was evidence of a inscription from Susa that says that a palace was adorned with lapis lazuli and carnelian originating from Sogdiana. So there's not a lot of evidence of satraps, but they've concluded that it was included in the satrapy of Bactria. So Sogdiana remained under Persian control until 400 BC during the reign of Artaxerxes II. There was rebellions, and essentially it remained independent until it was conquered by Alexander the Great. So again, the Scythians have a very well known for battle, and they were very effective warriors. And again, they lived like a nomadic people, and they spoke Bactrian and Indo-Iranian language, which was related to Sogdian. So there was trade, and another group called the Yuezhi, and they offered tributary gifts of jade to the emperors of China. And so there's a lot of records and the different, like China and Persian records. So they really never formed a huge great empire like the Kushan empires or that, but that said, they were centered on the city of Samarkand, and Sogdiana was really a part of the Uzbeki story. Many of the merchants would not travel the entire Silk Road, but would trade goods through middlemen based in oasis towns. So the Sogdians established a trading network across the 1,500 miles from Sogdiana to China. And they were a very mercantile trading nation, so they weren't really confined to particular borders, but essentially led and were the link between the two regions. And that leads us to Hierapolis, which was the city of Cyrus, an ancient city founded by Cyrus to mark the northeastern border of the Achaemenid Empire. It's identified as the modern city of Kujan in northern Tajikistan. Also, Alexander went through here as well. And that's, again, why it became known as Hierapolis in today's world. Hierapolis also may correspond to the modern-day city of Istarabshan, but the region around it was used as a sort of holding region for Greek populations that rebelled against Persia and were resettled there. So it's really has a Greek background because it was settled by Greeks thousands of years before the Persian conquest. But by the time of Alexander the Great, it had a very large Greek population. And next we have Bactria, which is an ancient region between the Hindu Kush Mountains and the Oxus River. It was historically often unified, but now it is divided amongst Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and a bit of Pakistan. Two of the significant cities are Samarkand and Kunduz. There's been home to empires since at least 2500 BCE. In fact, the great philosopher Zoroaster or Zarathustra is said to have come from Bactria. Next, we have Argosha, which is centered in the modern day of southern Afghanistan, and it's the capital was Alexandropolis, which is an ancient Greek city that's situated over what is now known as Kandahar. The region is mentioned in Achaemenid Persepolis tablets, and it's also mentioned under inscriptions of Darius and Xerxes as a subject people, and it was a source of ivory used in the palace of Susa, Darius' palace. The King of Kings, the records at least, recount that a Persian was defeated, so 3 times in fact, so that the province remained under control of Darius. So essentially there was a lot of rebel groups in this area, just like some of the other regions nearby. And they were under the command of a governor who, along with the Bactrians, tried to wrest control away from the Persians. But that said, when Alexander came through, he appointed his generals as governors. 3, 2, 1. Next, we have Gandhara, which is now northwest Pakistan, eastern Afghanistan. And again, it's part of the wider region of Sogdianus. But it was also the ancient Gandhara kingdom, and it's one of the 16 kingdoms listed in the ancient Buddhist texts. In the 6th century BC, it became part of the Achaemenid Empire, and it had a very fractured rule. There were many power struggles, and King Darius took control of this and eventually invaded. And in 518 BC, Darius took over this region, and it had a Persian centralized rule. And it was part of the Indus Valley satrapy again, and this was one of the provincial capitals, the Gandhara satrapy, which was established in 518 BCE. There is an inscription showing the people from Gandhara, and by about 380 BC, the Persian hold had weakened and many kingdoms sprang up. But in 327, Alexander came and conquered the rest of it, so that leads us to the Hindus, which is here. The Hindus were, of course, called the Indians by the Greeks, and this was a term to refer to people from all of this area. And even though there wasn't a lot of knowledge of the geography of this land by the West, but they did participate in the second invasion of Greece, in fact, so that's how there is some knowledge of them. They were supplying troops and elephants for the Achaemenid Empire, and they are depicted on the Achaemenid, or the tombs at Persepolis, or the buildings at Persepolis. And the representatives of the Hindus are depicted as bringing gifts, and they are in a stance characterized by loincloths, sandals, and exposed upper body, which is how they distinguish them from the Bactrians and the Aracosians. Now we have Drangiana. Next we have Drangiana, which was centered around the Helmand River in southwestern Afghanistan. In the ancient times, it was inhabited by an Iranian tribe that were known as Sarangians or Drangians by the Greeks, and they were possibly subdued by the Medes, but the great Cyrus invaded and took control, and it wasn't really until the time of Darius when they were placed in a similar group
because those generally deported to the Persian Gulf. So the capital of Trangiana is known as Zarin or Zranka, and it's again connected to extensive Iranian archaeological sites. So its neighboring area of Arachosia that's the satrap it was governed similarly to. So it was again conquered by Alexander afterwards. Now we have Patala, which is a region around the ancient city of Patala at the mouth of the Indus River in Pakistan, Sindh, Pakistan. The historians of Alexander state that the Indus parted into two branches, and that's where Patala was at before reaching to the sea. And there was a bit of an island that formed where it split, and that was called Patala. And in fact, Alexander constructed a harbor here. It was well known to mariners and traders of the ancient Mediterranean, but by the Middle Ages, map makers no longer knew its location. When it appeared on maps in the 15th and 16th century, it was in a variety of erroneous locations. And that leads us now to our last and final area, which is Sogdiana, which is a country of the 100 Cows, which is one of the easternmost regions of the Achaemenid Empire, and part of its 7th tax district. It was concluded with Gundara over here, and it was again into the Indus River and the basin around Banu in modern-day Pakistan. The location of Sogdiana is subject to debate, but it had association with the Gandhara, as I said. So the representatives of Sogdiana are characterized on reliefs in Persepolis by their loincloths and exposed upper bodies and sandals, like I said. So they do have similarities to the Gandharans as well. But Sogdiana is first mentioned in the inscription of Darius the Great as one of the provinces in revolt while the king was in Babylon. And the satrapy disappears from sources after 480 BCE, possibly being mentioned by a different name. And of course, it was conquered by Alexander the Great and became a part of the Seleucid Empire. So, that all said, that concludes our history of the Persian Empire. And this a map under Xerxes and Darius. It was a huge empire with an amazing, complex culture. And as you can see, after 5 or 6 hours, we haven't even touched on the thousands of cities that existed here. Only the main ones, but you can imagine the diversity of culture and history. So I'm so glad you joined me, and I hope that you'll join me for the next map video. And stay tuned, because the next video will be my most ambitious yet, so I'm super excited to share that with you. And that all said, have a great rest of your evening or whatever time of day it is, and I'll see you in the next one.